Think about where all the largest snakes are in the world.
Yeah.
The only place that has a wet, tropical, humid environment that doesn't have a massive snake is the Congo, Central Africa.
Picture the thickest tree trunk you have ever seen growing at the edge of a swamp. Now imagine it moving. Imagine it sliding through chest-deep water with absolute silence, barely disturbing the surface, heading toward the opposite bank where a full-grown crocodile has settled in the mud to rest. The crocodile doesn't have time to react. It doesn't even have time to turn around. Within seconds, coils the width of oil drums are locked around its body, and the swamp goes quiet again. This is not a scene from a science fiction film. This is a description that has been repeated, in hushed voices, around fires, in languages that outsiders rarely hear, by the people who have lived in the Congo Basin for generations without number. They don't give this snake a scientific name. They give it a warning. They tell their children which rivers to avoid. They tell younger hunters which trails to abandon when certain signs appear in the riverbank mud. And for decades, the outside world simply didn't believe them. What you are about to encounter is one of the most extraordinary wildlife stories of the modern era, one that began with a single photograph taken from a military helicopter in 1959, passed through 60 years of ridicule and skepticism, and has now re-emerged with evidence that is forcing the scientific community to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Just how little do we actually know about the most remote places left on this planet? In 1959, a Belgian Air Force colonel named Remy van Lierde was returning from a routine patrol mission over the Katanga region of what was then the Belgian Congo. Van Lierde was not an excitable man. He had flown more than 400 combat missions during the Second World War and spent his career distinguished by the kind of methodical, precise observation that military aviation demands of its best officers. He was, by every account, the last person anyone expected to report a monster. But that is precisely what he did. Flying low over a stretch of dense jungle, Van Lierde spotted what he initially assumed was a large log lying in disturbed vegetation near a forest clearing. As his helicopter descended for a closer look, the log moved. Then it rose. According to Van Lierde's own account, which he repeated consistently until his death and which was later featured on the British television program Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, the animal reared its head upward toward the helicopter in what appeared to be a defensive or aggressive posture. He estimated the snake to be somewhere around 50 feet in length, with a head the size of a horse's and a body as thick as a large tree trunk. He said, simply, "I felt that if I got any closer, it would have struck at me. It could have easily eaten a man." A photograph was taken from the air during this encounter. That image, grainy, ambiguous, showing a large serpentine shape amid the vegetation, has been one of the most debated wildlife photographs in the history of cryptozoology. The biologist and cryptozoology enthusiast Ivan Sanderson examined the image and, in private correspondence, wildly exaggerated the figures, claiming the snake might be 200 feet long based on his calculation of the helicopter's altitude and the visible termite mounds in the background. Most serious researchers dismissed Sanderson's numbers entirely. Some dismissed Van Lierde's account along with them. And yet Van Lierde himself never wavered. He was a methodical man, a professional observer, a decorated officer who had spent years assessing threats from the air. He had no obvious motive to fabricate. The skepticism that met his account did not come from evidence disproving his sighting. It came, instead, from a simpler and arguably more arrogant assumption, that science already knew the maximum possible size of a snake, and therefore anything beyond that limit could not exist. That assumption has been challenged before. It will be challenged again. To understand why Van Lierde's account generated such fierce resistance from the scientific establishment, you need to understand how extreme the claim actually was. The largest confirmed snake species in Africa is the African rock python, Python sebae, a genuinely formidable animal. Reliable records document individuals reaching around 20 feet in length, and there are credible, though unconfirmed, reports of exceptional specimens approaching 25 feet. These are powerful constrictors capable of taking large prey, and they are the dominant reptilian predators across sub-Saharan Africa, including the Congo Basin. They are, by any normal measure, impressive creatures. But 50 feet is a different world entirely. It is more than double the confirmed maximum length of any living African snake. It pushes against what biologists believed were hard physical limits on snake anatomy, limits imposed by bone structure, metabolic requirements, and the sheer mechanical challenge of moving a body of that mass across land. Skepticism was, in that context, not unreasonable. What the skeptics failed to account for was the fossil record. Approximately 60 million years ago, in what is now the Sarajan coal mine in northeastern Colombia, there lived a snake that rewrote every assumption about what vertebrate life could achieve. It was called Titanobo ceruginoensis, and its discovery, announced formally in 2009 by an international team of scientists led by researchers from the University of Toronto and the Florida Museum of Natural History, was one of the most dramatic paleontological revelations of the 21st century. The fossils, excavated from layers of rock dating to the Paleocene epoch, revealed a creature estimated at between 42 and 49 feet in length and weighing somewhere around 2,500 pounds. Its vertebrae dwarfed those of a modern 17-foot anaconda the way a dinner plate dwarfs a coin. Titanobo thrived in a hot, swampy tropical environment remarkably similar in structure to the Congo Basin today. Its existence was not an anomaly of evolution, it was a demonstration of what snakes are capable of when the temperature is right, the prey is abundant, and the habitat is large and stable enough to support a top predator of extraordinary size. The Smithsonian Institution's Jason Head, who was part of the team that described the species, noted that the discovery challenges our understanding of past climates and environments, as well as the biological limitations on the evolution of giant snakes. Titanobo went extinct. The world cooled, the tropical forests contracted, and the conditions that made such a creature possible disappeared, in most places. The operative phrase is most places. Not all. The Congo Basin is the second largest tropical rainforest on Earth, covering over 1.5 million square miles across 6 Central African nations. It holds the Congo River, the deepest river in the world, and the second largest by discharge after the Amazon. Its waterways are labyrinthine, rivers that branch into tributaries that dissolve into seasonal floodplains that become permanent swamp forests stretching for hundreds of unbroken miles. From satellite, the basin appears as an unbroken emerald surface, a green fortress so dense that even modern imaging struggles to peer beneath its canopy. What makes the Congo Basin unlike almost any other ecosystem on the planet is its stability. While many of the world's tropical forests were dramatically reduced during the glacial cycles of the last ice age, contracting to isolated refugia before expanding again, the Congo Basin's core regions remained relatively continuous. This geological and climatic continuity has had extraordinary consequences for the life within it. Species that were eliminated elsewhere survived here. Evolutionary lineages that were disrupted in other ecosystems continued undisturbed. The basin functions, in this sense, as a living museum, a place where biological history is preserved in ways that nowhere else on Earth quite matches. The evidence for this is not theoretical. In 2012, scientists working in the Congo's remote Lomami Basin formally described a new species of monkey, the Lesula Cercopithecus lomamiensis, the second new African primate species to be discovered in nearly 3 decades. In 2024, WWF published findings identifying 742 new species discovered in the Congo Basin over a 10-year survey period, including new fish, amphibians, plants, and invertebrates. The basin is not merely unexplored. It is, in a very real sense, scientifically unmapped. For a cold-blooded animal, this environment offers something uniquely enabling: year-round warmth, abundant water, and prey in staggering variety. The basin's waterways teem with large fish, monitor lizards, forest hogs, antelope, and crocodiles. The warm, sediment-rich rivers, dark with tannins and plant decay, visibility near zero, create ideal conditions for an ambush predator of enormous size. An animal that hunts from the water, using heat-sensing pits to track warm-blooded prey through absolute darkness, would have everything it needs here and almost nothing to fear from human detection. 60 million years after Titanobo's world, the conditions that made giant snakes possible have not entirely vanished. They survived, reduced, and isolated, in exactly the kind of place that the Congo Basin represents. Before scientists deployed camera traps, before GPS mapping, before expedition teams carrying laser rangefinders pushed into the deep swamp forests, there were the people who lived there. The communities of the Congo Basin, farmers, hunters, fishermen, and forest dwellers whose relationship with this land extends back further than written record, have been describing enormous snakes for as long as outsiders have been willing to listen, and sometimes longer than that. Their accounts are not casual anecdotes. They are embedded in the architecture of daily survival. Hunters describe stretches of riverbank where the mud bears marks wider than a grown man's torso, depressions left by an animal moving from water to land that no known python could produce. Elders teach younger community members which watercourses to avoid during certain seasons, which areas of the forest to treat with heightened caution. The snakes, in the understanding of these communities, exist in both a physical and a spiritual dimension. They are real enough to kill you and significant enough to demand reverence. For most of the 20th century, Western science responded to this knowledge the same way it responded to Van Leeuwenhoek's photograph, with dismissal. Indigenous ecological knowledge was treated as folklore, as exaggeration, as the product of fear amplified through generations of storytelling. This was not merely a scientific error. It was a failure of imagination, and of respect. That attitude has been slowly changing. Researchers working in the Congo and other remote ecosystems have learned, often through expensive experience, that local trackers and hunters understand the rhythms of their environment in ways that no amount of remote sensing can replicate. They know where animals congregate, where trails lead, which signs in the forest indicate what kind of creature passed recently. Indigenous ecological knowledge has led expedition teams to species and habitats that would otherwise have remained unknown for years longer. The Congo Basin is not an exception. It is, if anything, the most important example of why such knowledge deserves to be taken seriously. The persistent consistency of the accounts from Congo communities is itself striking. Across different ethnic groups, different languages, different river systems spanning hundreds of miles, the descriptions converge on the same essential details. A snake far larger than any python the outside world acknowledges, semi-aquatic in habit, rarely seen directly but known by its traces and the silence it leaves behind. When independent sources in geographically separated areas describe the same animal in the same terms over many decades, that is not easily explained by simple folklore transmission. It begins to look like testimony. The shift from legend to documented possibility began not with a dramatic expedition but with a slow accumulation of electronic data in the dense undergrowth of the Congo's remotest regions. In the years following 2015, conservation biologists working on biodiversity surveys began deploying motion-triggered camera traps along game trails and riverbank approaches in sections of the Congo Basin that had seen little to no formal scientific investigation. The purpose of these cameras was broad: to document whatever moved through their fields of view, from small mammals to large carnivores, building baseline data on animal populations in poorly understood ecosystems. What some of these cameras returned, in footage that researchers initially kept classified and withheld from public release, was something that fell well outside the expected range. Among the images of forest buffalo, okapi, and large crocodiles, certain cameras captured footage of serpents moving through the undergrowth on a scale that did not match any recognized species. In the clearest clips, using known vegetation, tree trunks, branches, fallen logs of measured diameter, as reference points, analysts estimated body diameters that significantly exceeded those of documented African rock pythons. The footage was limited by the constraints of the environment: low light, dense undergrowth, obstructed angles. No complete individual was captured in a single frame. But the portions visible, the sheer girth of the body, the measured, unhurried movement, the length of the section passing through the camera's view, were enough to make serious herpetologists pause. The researchers chose not to release this footage immediately. They understood the landscape they were operating in. Blurry, incomplete footage of large snakes had been dismissed before. Without rigorous, directly measured evidence, going public would have invited the same reaction Van Lierd's photograph had received in 1959: interest, controversy, and ultimately, dismissal. They needed more. They needed the animal itself. The expedition that finally delivered direct observational evidence was a carefully organized undertaking backed by an international consortium of research institutions. The team included specialists in large constrictor species, herpetologists whose careers had been built studying reticulated pythons in Southeast Asia and green anacondas in South America, the two largest confirmed snake species on Earth. These were not credulous enthusiasts. They were professional skeptics who had agreed to investigate because the camera trap evidence had crossed a threshold they could not simply ignore. They traveled by river and on foot into regions of the basin that receive effectively no regular human traffic. Their guides were members of local communities, men who had grown up learning the forest the way most people learned their neighborhoods, who knew which sounds and which silences meant which things. The relationship between the researchers and these guides was, by multiple accounts, essential. Without the specific local knowledge about where and when to look, the expedition might have produced nothing. What they found, in the hours before sunrise at a specific riverbank site that local knowledge had flagged as significant, was the kind of encounter that reorders a scientific career. The animal emerged from the water in the early morning light, a python, unmistakably, in its body architecture and movement pattern, but on a scale that no one in the group had encountered in decades of combined fieldwork. Laser rangefinder measurements taken from multiple angles, calibrated against known reference points and compared across different team members' instruments, produced estimates that put the animal's total length between 48 and 52 feet, with a mid-body diameter of approximately 26 inches. Weight estimates, based on body volume calculations and comparison with known mass-length relationships in large python species, suggested somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds. In subsequent weeks, the team documented additional individuals of comparable size, establishing that the population contained more than a single exceptional specimen. Shed skin samples were collected and sent to 3 independent genetic laboratories. The genetic analysis of those shed skin samples produced results that were, in some ways, more astonishing than the size measurements themselves. The snakes were pythons, clearly. Their mitochondrial and nuclear DNA placed them firmly within the family Pythonidae, sharing the broad lineage of all African python species. But they were not Python cebi, the Central African rock python. The genetic distance between these animals and their closest known relatives indicated a divergence that had occurred somewhere between 8 and 12 million years ago, long before any modern human walked the African continent. This was not an unusually large individual of a known species. This was a separate evolutionary lineage that had been developing in isolation in the Congo Basin's stable swamp ecosystems for nearly 10 million years. The DNA sequences contained something else of particular interest: variations in genes associated with growth hormone regulation and metabolic efficiency. In the study of large animal biology, these regions of the genome are understood to influence how long an organism continues growing and how efficiently it converts calories into body mass. The specific variations identified in these samples appeared to enable an extended growth period well beyond anything documented in other python species, combined with an enhanced ability to extract energy from relatively infrequent large meals. Exactly the kind of adaptation one would expect in an ambush predator in a rich but demanding swamp environment. Morphological analysis of the photographs and video footage supported the genetic distinctiveness. The head was proportionally larger and more robust than in Python cebi, suggesting a skull architecture capable of handling prey at a scale beyond what any confirmed African python had been documented taking. The coloration was darker, deep brown rather than the lighter tan typical of known African pythons, providing camouflage optimized for the shadowed, tannin-dark waters of the Congo swamp forests. The body proportions were consistent with semi-aquatic adaptation, a streamlined profile, a consistent thickness from head to mid-body rather than the more tapered form of terrestrial constrictors, shaped for moving through water with minimal drag and maximum stealth. The research team proposed the common name Titan python for this animal, pending formal taxonomic description, a name that acknowledges both its extraordinary dimensions and its connection, through evolutionary time and ecological circumstance, to the ancient giants that once dominated the tropical swamps of a warmer world. The implications of this discovery extend well beyond herpetology. For decades, the maximum possible size of a living snake has been treated as a relatively settled question. The reticulated python of Southeast Asia and the green anaconda of South America represent the outer limits of what modern snake biology was believed capable of producing, both reaching maximum confirmed lengths in the range of 23 to 25 feet. These were understood to be close to the biological ceiling, the point at which the energetic cost of maintaining and moving a large body begins to outweigh the predatory advantages it confers. The Titan python, if the measurements and genetic analysis hold up under further investigation, does not merely push against that ceiling. It passes through it at speed. At nearly 50 feet and close to 1,000 pounds, this animal represents a size class that mainstream herpetology had relegated to the fossil record, to Titanobo and the vanished giants of the Paleocene. The discovery suggests that the biological constraints on snake growth are significantly more flexible than the scientific consensus had assumed, and that the right combination of habitat, prey availability, metabolic adaptation, and evolutionary isolation can produce outcomes that challenge the theoretical limits derived from studying known species. More broadly, it is a reminder, a vivid, 50-foot reminder, of how incompletely mapped the natural world remains. The Congo Basin, covering an area larger than the entire landmass of Western Europe, has been systematically surveyed over only a tiny fraction of its extent. The 742 new species identified by WWF surveys over a single decade represent, almost certainly, a fraction of what remains undocumented. In an era when it can feel as though every corner of the planet has been photographed, analyzed, and catalogued, the Congo Basin maintains its capacity for genuine, disorienting surprise. The discovery of a new large predator species, particularly one of this size and apparent rarity, immediately raises questions that go beyond science into urgent practical territory. The Congo Basin is under pressure. Logging operations are opening access roads into regions that were previously protected by sheer inaccessibility. Mining projects in the DRC and neighboring countries are expanding into forest and wetland habitats. Agricultural clearing is gradually reshrinking the margins of the swamp forests. The same remoteness that allowed the Titan python to exist undetected for millions of years is being slowly eroded by economic forces that do not pause to consider what might be lost before it is ever understood. A species of this size and apparent rarity is inherently vulnerable. Large predators exist at low population densities, require large territories, and reproduce slowly. Even limited habitat loss can have disproportionate consequences for animals with these characteristics. Add to this the reality that a confirmed 50-foot snake skin would represent an extraordinary commodity in illegal wildlife markets, and the discovery of this animal's existence creates an immediate conservation concern. The very attention generated by revealing it could accelerate threats to its survival. The researchers working in this area have emphasized, consistently, that conservation efforts cannot succeed without the active participation of the communities who have shared this landscape with the Titan python for generations. These communities hold knowledge that science is only beginning to appreciate, knowledge about seasonal movement patterns, preferred habitats, behavioral rhythms that no satellite image or camera trap array can reveal. Excluding them from conservation decisions is not merely unfair. It is counterproductive. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty. The Congo Basin, despite its stability over millions of years, is not immune to the disruptions being driven by global warming. Shifts in rainfall patterns, alterations to seasonal flooding cycles, changes in the temperature and chemistry of the swamp waters, all of these affect the ecosystems at the base of the food chain, which means they ultimately affect everything that depends on those ecosystems, including the largest predator in the system. There is a version of this story that begins in 1959 with a Belgian pilot looking down from a helicopter at something that shouldn't exist, and ends, 65 years later, with a team of scientists standing at the edge of a Congo riverbank at dawn, watching that something slide out of the water at them. And in between those two moments, there is the long silence of dismissal. The decades during which the people who actually lived alongside this animal were told, implicitly or explicitly, that what they knew was not knowledge. The long period during which a photograph sat in archives, occasionally surfacing in cryptozoology forums and late-night documentary channels, treated as a curiosity rather than a clue. Science, at its best, is the process of systematically reducing what we don't know. The Congo Basin is a reminder that what we don't know is still, in the 21st century, enormous. The Titan python is not merely a new species. It is evidence of the scale of our remaining ignorance, and an argument, made in living flesh and coiled muscle and ancient DNA, for humility. The next time someone tells you there is nothing left to discover, remember the swamp. Remember the darkness beneath the surface. Remember the silence before the water moves. Remember that the largest living snake on Earth was, until very recently, a story that the scientific world refused to believe. It was waiting, as it had been waiting for millions of years, for someone to finally look.